Well, thank you again, both of you, for joining the Joseph Miller Memorial Lecture today. Just a very brief introduction from my side. João Fragoso is full professor of history at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And among many articles and book chapters, he's the author of a book that is called, well, I translated here, Rich Merchants. So in Brazilian, we have kind of a very old expression, Homens, grossa, aventura, which means apparently wealthy merchants, accumulation and hierarchy in the mercantile market of Rio de Janeiro, 1690 to 1830. This book won a prize, or the prize of the Brazilian National Archives, in 1991. And he is also the co-editor of a 3-volume work, Colonial Brazil from 1443 to 1822, 3 volumes, as I mentioned. And this book has also won a prize. It was the winner of the Jabuti Prize in Humanities in 2015, and is currently in its 6th edition. And then we have Thiago Krause, who was, well, a PhD student of João, but is now sitting in Princeton at the institute, at the very famous Institute for Advanced Study there. He is normally assistant professor of colonial Brazilian history at the Federal University of the State of Rio de Janeiro. And among other works, he's the co-author of a work that is called Empire in Dispute, Crown, Oligarchy, and People in the Formation of the Brazilian State, 1823 to 1870, which has very recently been published this year. It's a very fresh publication. And now he is co-authoring a book on the global history of colonial Salvador with Christopher Ebert. So I'm very, very happy that you are here. And now the floor is yours. And as I understood it correctly, then you give the talk while Thiago is giving the talk for João, but in the question and answer session, we can of course put questions to both of them, and in Portuguese or in English. We have people here probably that can translate them, or Thiago can translate them for João, and then he can translate his answer for the public here into English. So thank you very much again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Kurman. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be invited. I would to me and João to be able to speak of in such a distinguished venue, even though it's virtually. It's a great pleasure to be here. So what are we going to do? I'm going to present kind of a summary of our research, both mine and João. João has been doing the research for the past 30 years, more or less. So and I'm doing this research on the global history of Salvador with Chris Ebert. So it's kind of a summation of the work of 3 researchers right here. So what I'm presenting is not my work alone. And we'll try to give you a big picture, an overview of the changes in the history of these 2 areas, Bahia and Rio de Janeiro. Bahia was a capital in the period we're covering here, for 1600 to 1750, and Rio was the capital just after this period ended. So we are going to try to give you an overview of this period and to show you the changes that happened, how slavery changed, how the slave trade changed, and to put this in a wider Atlantic context. If I'm speaking too fast, please just type in the chat and let me know. So I'm going to start the presentation now. As I see, Jan has put the link in the chat, so I upload it online so anyone can see it afterwards or follow it, because I probably won't be able to show everything here because of the time. I always go a little bit overboard in these things and draw and write too much stuff in the PowerPoint, but too much stuff in my PowerPoint. So if I show something too quickly and want to take a look, so here you have the link. So let's start. Just to give you, I think one of the things João has taught me. João was my PhD advisor, and we've been collaborating for the past, I don't know, 12 years. And one of the things João has taught me is the importance of population estimates. We have an idea of how many people were there, who were these people. So just to give you an idea about the changes in the spirit, in the late 16th century, Bahia, the captaincy, the province of Bahia had something like 20,000 people among native Brazilians, among enslaved Africans, which were very few at the time, and Portuguese people. And Rio was much smaller, had 4,000 in the same, more or less same period, 1585. So we don't have a lot more estimates for the rest of the century, but 100 years later, Bahia had 50,000 people, and Rio had more or less half that, almost half that. But then it started to grow even more quickly in the following 100 years, partially because of the gold discoveries and increase in trade and migration and all that. So, but even so, in the mid 18th century, when the Salvador, which was Bahia's capital, was going to lose its role as Brazilian capital, Salvador was still bigger than Rio, more or less about 20% bigger. Rio would only overtake Salvador in the late 18th century, and the captaincy of Bahia was significantly bigger than Rio. So we had something like 50,000 people for the city of Salvador in 1759 against 36,000 for Rio 10 years earlier. So it doesn't look that much, but it was both at this time, both Rio and Salvador were bigger than any town, any city in Portugal, but Lisbon. Because Porto, which was the second biggest city in Lisbon, in Portugal had something like 20,000, 25,000. So in the Portuguese Empire, these were actually large cities. And from the late 17th century onwards, Salvador, from the second half of the 17th century up to the late 18th century, Salvador was actually the largest city in the Atlantic seaboard of the Americas, because the bigger cities of Spanish America, they were in the interior. So Rio was bigger than all of the other. Salvador, was bigger than all of the other cities in the Atlantic coast, but it only lost its position to Rio and then New York and Philadelphia in the late 18th century, early 19th century. So even in the American context, these were large port towns, and even more important, they were large slave trading ports. So that's why they're interesting. One of the main reasons I think that their history is interesting for all of those that study Atlantic slavery and Atlantic port. They were kind of similar in a way. They were both part of the Portuguese Empire. They were both built by men who brought with them, by men who brought with them this idea that inequality was natural and had to be naturalized. They brought from Portugal the idea that society was unequal and must be unequal, that society was like a body that was composed of different parts, different members, and to work in a harmonious way, it had to maintain and reproduce inequality. So when these men arrived here in Brazil, they didn't expect that they had no problems in creating an extremely unequal society, because inequality was something they valued, something they thought was needed. And of course, this meshed very nicely with a setting based on slavery, on commodity production, and all that. So both lived reality and European ideology worked together to create these slave societies, both in Rio and in Bahia. Both areas were had sugar producing hinterlands, the Recôncavo da Bahia and Recôncavo da Guanabara, which are the rural areas near Salvador and Rio de Janeiro, which produced the sugar. And they both had overseas markets located outside Portugal. First, Northern Europe, and then mostly Southern Europe, the Mediterranean. So the markets they produced to were also similar throughout this whole period we're working on. Both areas saw the development of land-owning elites who became nobilities, who saw themselves and represent and self-fashioned themselves as nobilities, and were accepted as such by society and by the crown. And both afterwards saw the development of merchant communities, communities that had interest in the slave trade, that were at a point started controlling credit relations and work in the export-import trades with Portugal, and then later to the interior of Brazil, to the gold mining areas. Despite all these similarities, we are going to show there were very different social formations that develop in a different way. So why? That's one of the things we want to show here. And we're going to show that these developments were also different from the ones in the Caribbean and all that. So when we were thinking how to organize this, we reread the Miller's major book, The Way of Death. So we're trying to be inspired by his analysis, which was in a way quite Brodellian. So he is perhaps one of the more Brodellian historians of the Atlantic. So we're trying to be inspired by him as well in our talk today. I should have said in the beginning, but I kind of forgot. I'm going to make some missteps like this because I'm not reading a test. I don't like to read when I give talks. So please forgive me any of this back and forth. But let's go on now. So from the very beginning, everyone knew that Brazil was based on slavery. The Brazil was a slave society. Not only Brazil had a large population of slaves, but because slaves were, as a Sergeant Major Joe Campos Moreno wrote in the early 17th century, because from it depended the remedy of all other things. From slavery depended, everything hinged on slavery. And he wrote this while in Bahia. But a little bit later, another guy wrote more or less the same thing about Rio. But instead of focus on slavery in general, he wrote about indigenous slavery. Because, as you're going to see, one of the differences between Rio and Bahia is the importance of indigenous slavery. Both of these societies were built on the back of native Brazilians. Indigenous slavery had a seminal role both in Rio and in Bahia. But the difference is that Bahia was able to make a transition to African slavery a few decades earlier, probably. We can't pinpoint the exact moment of this transition because we don't have probate records, post-mortem inventories that would allow us to do that, such as John Combs did for 17th century Virginia. But we are more or less able to see that Bahia managed this transition a few decades earlier because it exhausted the access to indigenous people to be enslaved, and while Rio was able to enslave them for a few more decades. And why was this important? Because when this big change of from indigenous slavery to African slavery happened from the late 16th century and early 17th century in Bahia, it meant that landowners became very indebted because they had to pay for these enslaved Africans. They had to pay a lot more than they had to pay for indigenous laborers. So this transition caused the bankruptcy of loads of the first sugar mill owners in this moment, the late 16th century, early 17th century. But in Rio, this probably happened in the mid 17th century or something like that, though we can't know for sure. And why is this important? Because this delay allowed the first families of Rio de Janeiro, the first families of this local elite, to maintain a higher degree of continuity. So from the late 16th century to the mid 18th century, the noble families of Rio de Janeiro were able to maintain a higher degree of continuity. And this particular moment was very important because it allows them to keep themselves in power. While in Bahia, the elite families only established themselves in the 17th century. So the degree of the elite families that persisted until the 19th century established themselves a little bit later than Rio de Janeiro, because they only established themselves after this transition to African slavery. Their 16th century roots were much shallower than Rio. And I think this transition had a central place in that. And what's interesting to note is that the slave trade wasn't built to supply Brazil. The foundations of the slave trade were actually arose as loads of new work on Spanish America has shown, such as Dave DeWitt for the Spanish Caribbean, or Cara Schultz, and before that Vila Vilar and all that, that the slave trade first arose to supply Spanish America, but Bahia and Rio, they were important way stops to where these slave ships stopped or which we exported these enslaved Africans to Spanish America. So Bahia, we exported enslaved Africans to Rio de la Plata, and Rio de Janeiro even more so to Rio de la Plata. But Bahia also exported them or served as a way station for the slave trade that went to Cartagena and New Spain. So the foundations of the slave trade were trans-imperial in nature. But of course, this was helped because at this time, from the late 16th century to the mid 17th century, more precisely from 1580 to 1630, Portugal and Spanish America were part of the same composite monarchy. So this was a second point I wanted to emphasize, that even the early development of slavery was part of this trans-imperial connections. Salvador at the time was capital. Salvador's capital since was founded in 1539. But both it and Rio de Janeiro lagged behind Pernambuco, which was the richest sugar-producing areas. But after the Dutch invasions, after the Dutch conquered Pernambuco in 1630 and stayed there until their expulsion in 1654, Pernambuco economy suffered a lot in this more than 2 decades of war, and in Rio and Bahia increased its political and military importance, because everyone knew that if Bahia fell, probably all of Brazil would fall to the Dutch. So Bahia grew its military importance, and its local elite also grew its importance because its local elite was played a crucial role to defend the city from the Dutch. And of course, both in Rio and Bahia, who were this local elite in the early 17th century? They were sugar mill owners, they were enslavers, and they gradually, by this mid-17th century, started to self-fashion themselves as a nobility. They started to present themselves as a nobility, to reproduce themselves by intermarriage as a nobility, and to try to differentiate themselves from the rest of the population. And they used their dominion, their monopoly of political power to do that. So after the Dutch invasion, Bahia increased its political importance, but Rio was the one that benefited the most economically. This is a you can see these are from notarial records. And what you can see in that the most important area was in notarial records in Portugal were Pernambuco. And Rio was really not very important. Bahia had more or less half, a little bit less than half the importance of Pernambuco, and Rio perhaps a fifth of the importance of Pernambuco at the time, or even less. But in the 1630s, thanks to the invasion into Pernambuco, the invasion in Pernambuco, and the war that deeply affected Bahia production as well, the number of sugar mills in Rio doubled. So in a way, and what's interesting is that the same context that allowed in the 1630s the development of Barbados in the Caribbean, this crisis, this war, what Wim Kloeser has called the Dutch moment, allowed first the development of Rio de Janeiro. But while Barbados was able to grow and outpace in the late 17th century Bahia, it didn't happen in Rio. Rio had one or two decades of really a lot of growth, and from what seems from the number of mills that were built in this time, especially the 1630s. Perhaps there was some infusion of capital as well, as a few men from Pernambuco moved to Rio, but it wasn't enough to establish it as a major sugar producer for the whole time, as we will see in a bit. Beyond the Dutch invasion, there was also a major change in the Atlantic world in 1630, which was the breakup of the Iberian Monarchy. There was a palace coup in 1630, and the Duke of Braganza was elevated to the Portuguese throne in 1630. And why was this important? This was important for three different reasons. The first one is that it severed the connections, or at least tried to, but this temporarily it severed the connections with the Spanish America. And it opened the door for the Dutch and a lesser scale the English in the slave trade, and also in trading with Spanish America, largely thanks to the slave trade. So this severed a connection that had been absolutely crucial to the early making of the Brazilian economy. In the 1630s, what became a major problem in Brazil? It was the lack of specie, the lack of coins, because the coins that usually were used in Brazil came from Spanish Americas. So I have two letters here. One letter is from the Governor General of Brazil in Bahia, who complained that that so much money had been sent to Portugal that trade in Bahia had basically stopped. And why that? Because they couldn't get currency from the Rio de la Plata anymore, and also Angola had been invaded by the Dutch the year before, in 1631. And this lack of currency in Bahia reverberated in Rio de Janeiro. Why? Because in Rio, they were complaining, they were being forced to send their currency, their coins, to Salvador. It was like the coins were sent from Rio to Bahia, and then from Bahia to Portugal. But so Brazil was being drained of its coins because it wasn't able anymore to replenish their monetary base by trade with Buenos Aires. So they tried to trade with Buenos Aires to reestablish trade with Buenos Aires. Of course, trade with Buenos Aires was important because Potosi silver went out, was smuggled to Buenos Aires, and then was smuggled to Brazil. But they weren't able to do that. So that was one major change that happened in the 1630s. This also is just to give an idea about the slave trade, the early slave trade to Brazil and Spanish America, based on the slave voyages, the transatlantic slave trade database. But data for the 17th century is really spotty, so we can't be sure that this works very well, but it serves to give you an idea of that. So you can see that the Spanish Circum-Caribbean was the most important area that received the slave Africans until the mid 1620s. Only then was started to be surpassed by Brazil. But even so, it wasn't really something. Brazil wasn't really so much in any area. Brazil was really that much important than Spanish Caribbean. Only the Portuguese Restoration, 1640, really diminished the importance of the slave trade to the Spanish Circum-Caribbean. The second major difference of the 1640s, major effect of the 1640s, was that the new Portuguese dynasty, it was weak and it had to rely on these local elites all over the empire. So it's in Brazil, specifically in Rio and Salvador, this weakness of the Portuguese monarch after the Restoration reinforced the power of these local elites, of sugar mill owners, that in this particular time were able to establish themselves as local nobilities. They and to reproduce themselves through time and to get privilege. Bahia, for instance, was able to send representatives to the Portuguese Parliament, the Cortes, from 1653 up to the late 17th century. So that was a second major impact of the Portuguese Restoration in 1604. And the third is that it emboldened the Portuguese in Pernambuco to revolt against the Dutch in 1640s, which also would have major effects afterwards, but do not concern us here very much. But this restoration in Portugal was also crucial for an event that shows how the connections between Brazil and Africa, especially Angola, were more important. This local elite in Rio that had strengthened itself for the past 2 decades, that were demanding lots of laborers, thanks to this accelerated construction of sugar mills, and that couldn't rely that much on enslaved indigenous laborers anymore. Probably they financed the reconquest of Angola. As I said, Angola had been conquered by the Dutch in 1641. And who conquered Angola back for the Portuguese crown? There was not a fleet from Portugal, from Lisbon, that did that. It was a fleet from Rio de Janeiro, which reconquered Angola. And it established definitely that bilateral relation between Angola and Brazil. So it was a major sugar mill owner, but also Portuguese aristocrat that would later die in Portugal and establish his family there, which was Salvador Correia de Sá, who led the fleet, but was the real local nobility who financed this fleet for Lloyd, for the Portuguese crown, but also because they wanted, that was probably the main reason, because they wanted and they felt they needed these enslaved laborers. So they reconquered Angola in 1648. And after Salvador Correia de Sá, many of the governors of Angola in the following 2 decades came from Brazil, mostly from Pernambuco, André Vidal Negreiros and João Fernandes Vieira. And they warred in Angola, trying to get enslaved Africans to sell to Brazil, not only to Pernambuco, but also to Rio and to Rio and Bahia as well. So now we're coming to the second half of the 17th century. Just as Rio had risen when Bahia was preoccupied with the war against the Dutch, now Rio will stagnate. Why? Because Rio will have to compete with a resurgent Bahia sugar production. So you can see that just as the number of sugar mills in Rio had doubled in the 1630s, the number of sugar mills in Bahia doubled from 1663 to 1665, while the number of sugar mills in Bahia, in Rio, was more or less stagnated. And we have to remember that sugar mills in Bahia were usually a lot bigger than those in Rio. So the production capacity, the number of slaves, the enslaved Africans they employed, was higher. And João has drawn this table that's very interesting. It shows that in the late 17th century, lots of sugar mills, 57 to be more precise, were sold in Rio de Janeiro because they were too indebted. And why it happened? It happened because Rio sugar mills couldn't compete with Bahia production. And even Bahia production at the time was having a big problem competing with Caribbean production, mainly Barbados. But if Barbados was rising, if France and England were putting restrictions to the import of Brazilian sugar, how did Bahia production manage to rise? Partially because the price of slaves in the 1660s and the 1670s was more or less, they were more or less cheap because of that many wars in Angola, but largely because Brazil found a new market. This is the image of a consulta, opinion of the Portuguese Overseas Council from 1687. That I'm putting here because I just got it from the archive. I just got a copy from the archive last week, and they say really clearly that they are only able to sell Brazilian commodities, sugar and tobacco, of which we're going to speak a little bit more shortly, in Spain and Italy, in the Mediterranean, because they couldn't sell anymore to the English, the Spanish, and to the English, the French, and the Dutch. So there was a change in the axis from the North Atlantic to the Mediterranean. So that was a major change that happened in the second half of the 17th century. So Brazilian commodities found a new market. That was one way to stand Caribbean competition. But the other way to withstand were making local interventions on currency. So both Bahia and Rio, both elites in both Bahia and Rio tried to overvalue the currency to avoid to stop it from going to Portugal. And they tried to influence as much as they could sugar prices. They tried to set sugar prices higher than merchants were willing to pay in order to be able to survive, to withstand this Caribbean. So they're trying to cut into the profit margins of merchants to survive in this extremely competitive Atlantic markets. Also, another way they tried to survive was that they still controlled the credit markets, because credit in the late 17th century, both in Rio and Bahia, didn't depend that much on merchants, but depended a lot more on local institutions. The judges of the orphans in Rio de Janeiro, which controlled the money of kids whose parents had died while they were too young, and the Santa Casa de Misericórdia, the Holy House of Mercy, lay brotherhood that also lent a lot of money in Salvador to sugar planters. So it's interesting that we can see that Rio and Bahia were kind of inverted mirrors in the 17th century. When Bahia was suffering a problem, Rio grew. When Bahia was growing, Rio stagnated. And why couldn't Rio compete with Bahia? Largely because Rio sugar was deemed to be of lesser quality. This is a letter from a merchant in Barcelona from the early 18th century in which he says that his correspondent in Lisbon should buy preferably Bahia sugar, and he should pay a little bit more for Bahia sugar because Bahia sugar was deemed better than Rio sugar. So it's one of many data points that show that. But if you read the complaints from the Rio elite, they say that repeatedly. They complain that they couldn't compete with Rio de Janeiro, with Bahia, because merchants didn't want to buy Rio sugar. This is an example from 1669. Merchants don't use the proceeds from their sales in Rio to buy Rio sugar. They send their money to Bahia to buy finer sugar and tobacco, of which there's great trade in Salvador. And this has been one of the great damage that the fleets of the Brazil company have caused to the inhabitants of Rio de Janeiro, because all of the currency has passed to Bahia. So this shows how they were competing in the 17th century. As we can see in this petition by the Rio agent in Lisbon, there was also this Bahia at the time developed a new product that gave it an advantage over Rio, which was tobacco. Tobacco became a global product that was consumed in Europe, in the Mediterranean, but it was also consumed in West Africa, in India, in China, and in the North American Great Lakes. So tobacco became a global product, much more global than sugar, and it gave an advantage to Bahia, because tobacco was used also to buy, started to be used also in the late 17th century to buy enslaved Africans from the Costa da Mina, from West Africa, mostly the Bight of Benin. So that also gave Bahia an advantage over Rio. So despite Caribbean competition, Brazilian sugar production, mostly in Bahia, but also Rio, managed to survive. And with it, this local nobility survived, consolidated their dominion over local institutions, and used this dominion to intervene politically in the markets, to survive, and to cut the profit margins of merchants, so they could keep a larger share of the profits generated by sugar production to them. So power and the economy were, of course, extremely interrelated. In the 17th century, it started a local mercantile community started to develop in Bahia, but it didn't yet control the slave trade. That would happen later in the 18th century. And also at this time, I'm going a little bit fast enough to try to finish the presentation in time. This also in the late 17th century, connections with other places started to develop and to consolidate. First with Angola, as we've already said, after the Rio reconquest of Angola in 1648-49, but also with the Rio de la Plata, with there was many voyages to Buenos Aires to try to establish trade, and people in Buenos Aires wanted to establish this trade because they wanted to buy enslaved Africans, but also, fundamentally with the foundation of the Colônia de Sacramento, which was a Portuguese colony to smuggle, to get silver in exchange for tobacco, sugar, and enslaved Africans to sell in Buenos Aires, but also with India. And why was this important? This graph shows the percentage of ships from India that stopped on Salvador on the way back to Portugal. And why is that important? Because these ships brought with them Indian textiles. And these Indian textiles were absolutely crucial because they were a very coveted product, not only in Brazil, but also in Africa. So they became a major item to trade for enslaved Africans, especially in Angola. So these connections, they were beyond the Atlantic, but they were important largely because they reinforced the slave trade, which was the most important connection that Brazil had. So, trying to wrap up, we arrived to the early 18th century, the first half of the 18th century, and all changes a lot changed in the early 18th century. Why? Because the gold discoveries in Minas Gerais, they forced the gold mining areas. They required as many slaves as could be sold to them. And so now sugar planters, the local nobility of Rio and Bahia, had to compete not only with the Caribbean, which increased the price of slave Africans in the African coast, but also with the gold mining areas. So they are being besieged in two fronts because of this competition. So the Caribbean production really rose in the 18th century. First Jamaica and then San Domingo, while Bahia sugar production more or less stagnated. It was able to grow a little bit in the first 2 decades, thanks to increased demand, to wars like the Wars of Spanish Succession, which disrupted the Caribbean markets. But after that, from 1723 more or less, it completely stagnated. We don't have numbers that are very precise for Rio, but we can see João was able to count in all notarial records from Rio the number of sugar mills. And what is see? The number of sugar mills went down by more than half in the early 18th century, the first half of the 18th century. Why? Because Rio couldn't withstand the competition with Bahia and the Caribbean, but also because the Rio economy is what became ever more mercantile, ever more directed to supplying the gold mining areas. So the merchants started to rise, and the local nobility, the sugar planters, had to contend with an ever more difficult situation in the first half of the 18th century. And what compounded this difficult situation was that they started to lose power over sugar prices. From the late 18th century, culminating in the installation of the inspection board in 1751, the crown started to intervene on how prices were set. So first, the crown decided in the late 17th century, the prices had to be established in agreement between planters and merchants. And then, from the 1720s, at least in Bahia, we don't know that as well for Rio, that the viceroy started intervening. And when merchants and planters couldn't agree, he always set the price that merchants wanted. So now, sugar from the 1720s onwards, the sugar planters in Bahia couldn't set the prices at a higher level, because they didn't have only to contend with merchants. They had to they lost because the viceroy sided with the merchants. So that was a big problem from them. So prices of sugar were dropping, or more or less stagnating, and demand for the price they were being paid for enslaved Africans was too high, and they couldn't keep up. So this was a particularly difficult moment, and that's why in the second half of the 18th century, Rio's sugar planting elites, this local nobility of Rio de Janeiro, started to disappear. While in Bahia, they managed to survive long enough to take advantage of the disruption of the sugar market after the Haitian Revolution in the late 18th century. So it was in Rio, sugar production mostly moved to Campos, to the north of the captaincy, while in Bahia, the Recôncavo, the area around Salvador, kept being a slave-producing sugar area up to abolition, up to 1880. So that's one of the difference between Rio and Bahia. And why was perhaps Bahia elite able to do that? Because Rio in the first half of the 18th century, Bahia for the first half of the 18th century, still received more enslaved Africans than Rio. Rio only surpassed Bahia in the 1750s, but even so, a lot of these enslaved Africans were not being kept around Rio de Janeiro, the Recôncavo da Guanabara. They were being sent to Minas Gerais. They were being sent to Campos de Goytacazes, while the Bahia elite probably was able to get a little bit more because the sugar was more valued than the Rio sugar, and also because they had this advantage of tobacco, which probably perhaps made the slave trade a little bit easier. So there was kind of a specialization of slave trading routes. Bahia mostly traded with Costa da Mina, as we can see in this graph here. So the blue is Bahia. Bahia mostly traded with Costa da Mina, which was kind of a free-for-all, was a trans-imperial zone. Bahian ships traded with the Dutch, the English, the Danish, even the Germans. In the late, if you look at the records of the Brandenburg Company, they traded with the Germans in the late 17th century. There's not much research on that, perhaps because there's not much documentation, but there's a few records that show us that Bahians traded with the Dutch for the Germans in the Brandenburg areas in the late 17th century. But so Bahia dominated this Costa da Mina area largely thanks to tobacco, but also to gold, while Rio mostly concentrated itself with the trade with Angola. And Angola wasn't a trans-imperial zone. Angola was a trade largely dominated until the 1730s by the governors. The governors were the main slave traders at this area. They used their political power to control the trade at this time. So it was the difference between a kind of ancien regime trade and a kind of a completely there was a completely trans-imperial zone with a lot of smuggling and all that the Portuguese knew they had to accept, Portuguese crown knew they had to accept, because the only way to get enough enslaved Africans to supply Brazilian demand. This one, it's a report from the most famous Portuguese diplomat ever, Dom Luís da Cunha, in which he says that I have known for a long time the merchants have no more king and country than their own interests and their book of account, and their account book, or rather their unaccountable books. So it's kind of making a pun, trying to emphasize how Bahia merchants smuggled gold and tobacco, fine tobacco, and textiles and sugar with the Europeans, but the Portuguese could do nothing. They had to accept it. So that probably was one of the reasons that explain how the Bahian elite, Bahian sugar nobility could survive until the late 18th century. Another major difference is that, another major point is that this early 18th century saw the development of American-based slave traders. It was the first era of the Americas where slave traders were not based in Europe. They were based in a colonial city. They controlled all aspects of the trade. Lisbon traders did not control, Portuguese traders did not control, and did not have a great deal of influence over the trade to Costa da Mina. Rio would develop a similar relationship to Angola, and even closer relationship to Angola, but that would take longer. Probably only after the 1770s that would happen, based, among other things, on the work of Joseph. We can see on the work of Joseph Miller. But despite Bahia managed to retain its role, its inglorious, its infamous role of the first slave trading out of the Americas until 1750, Rio ended up surpassing. Why? Because Rio managed to establish itself as the main supplier to South Central Brazil, especially to Minas Gerais, and these internal markets became ever more important. So when Rio became capital in 1763, it was already the largest slave trading port of the Americas, not because because of its slave production, but mostly because it redistributed this to a wide area that was not only focused on exports to Europe, but also to supply with food and mostly food, this growing internal market. So the Rio consolidation as a major slave trading port was quite different from what happened in Bahia, even though Bahia also was a major supply of enslaved Africans to Minas Gerais up to the mid 18th century. So, I think I've already overstayed my welcome. So just to finish here, I would like to emphasize that our research makes a point that João has been making for the past 30 or 40 years. Brazil was not only a giant sugarcane field. Brazil had internal dynamics that differentiated highly from the Caribbean. But there are still major points to be researched, and we're still working on that. João has found, for instance, the development of direct and indirect connections between masters, enslavers, and their enslaved through ritual kinship to god-parenthood. So far, we haven't been able to establish that this happened in other places. So, was this particular to Rio? Was this a tactic of an embattled local nobility to survive in the early 18th century? Or everyone did that? We don't know. We don't know. That's something that needs more research in other areas beyond Rio. Other point that happened in both Rio and Bahia was the multiplication of free people of color. It started in the early 18th century, but really rocketed in the late 18th century, when the number of free people of color surpassed the number of white people. And even more important, this slave ownership spread among this group as well. So slavery was able to continue for so long in Brazil because every elite in Brazil depended on slavery. Even middle class people depend on slavery. So slavery was not only national in Brazil, or not only became national in Brazil, different from the West in the 19th century, but also from the late 18th century onwards. Slavery was also something that was spread all over all over society. We'd even find slaves that owned slaves. That seemed to be surprisingly common. A few hundred cases have been found in 18th century Salvador of enslaved people who own other slaves. So it shows how how widespread was slavery. So I think I should finish here because I've already spoke too much. So once more, thank you for your attention, and we're open to questions. And if you want to, as Professor Kahneman said, if you want to ask questions for João, we can translate to him as well, and he can translate his answers as well. So thanks a lot, people.